Thank you. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. I'm from just outside of Vancouver, BC, and I parked my dog sled out front. I hope that's okay. They have been fed. My igloo is melting, so I'll have to make a different house when I get home.
You could just put one of those orange vests on them and brought them in.
Yeah, I could. But there's one that's very rabid out there, so I just like to keep him outside. Anyway, yeah, so that's where I'm from. I started writing as a kid and wrote a fantasy novel when I was 16, and then I wrote movies, and then I wrote a lot of short stories, and then I started drinking, and then I became an alcoholic, and then I got sober, and then I started writing poetry. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell. And so in 2014 I started writing on Instagram and sharing it, typing it out, and taking a picture of it, and I started calling myself the hopeless loser. And if you check that hashtag, you might find a poem or two from that long ago. Anyway, so some people started saying, you know, you're a really good poet and you're a good writer, you should change your name because it sounds really terrible. No one's hopeless, John. So I thought, okay, well, I kind of had to think about it, and I thought, well, one of the reasons I started writing and sharing on Instagram was because, yeah, I am an alcoholic. I'm in recovery 3.5 years now, but that first year of attempted sobriety was a pain in the ass. It was harder than I thought it was going to be. And so when I started writing, I thought about what I was doing with my writing. Well, what am I trying to accomplish? Is this just for me? Is this just to get famous? Is this to help other people? So, you know, what I was trying to do is I was trying to steal my love of language and art and poetry back from my addiction. So going from writing poems every day for my wife and kids to not writing for 10 years. So it was kind of like, okay, what am I doing? I'm a bandit of my love from my addiction. So I'm going to read a little bit first from my first book, which will set up the book that's in the store. So I like to do that because it's necessary. Because the published book, You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering, kind of picks up where this one leaves off. First one, there we go. So this one's called The Liquor Store Grasshopper. 11 p.m. every bloody night, 11 p.m. So many writers talk about the early hours of the morning as a time where they feel the great weight of love sitting upon their chest like a demon Beelzebub sends out to rouse the God-fearing from a peaceful slumber. But for me, it's 11 p.m. 11:01 p.m. was my heaven, and anything before 10:59 p.m., my hell. It was always up until that last minute when the willpower would fade and I would weasel my way out of the car and into the hen house to pluck the 1 or 2 eggs that would seal the evening for me and wrap it up with a beautiful wine-soaked bow tie. Because, you know, I was never the ant when it came to drinking. I wasn't one for stockpiling the shelves, reining in the harvest into beautifully built storehouses so that when famine set in, I'd be sitting pretty. I was the lazy grasshopper, waiting until the last minute to indulge the senses just one last time before sleep came and washed away my worries. But when the locusts came and went and left me there, sober, emaciated, and gray, standing but dead, I decided that I must wait just one more minute for 11:01 p.m. because that was when the liquor store closed and I would be free, at least until morning. You can save your clapping for the end. That's a good one.
But I might not want to.
That's okay. Whatever you want. Hoop, holler, woot, woot. This one's called The Four Corners of My Life. These were the 4 horsemen who came to me with great fury in the later years of my life, when my faith was its weakest and I had been dealt a blight. 1. Alcoholism. He is the convincer. With honey on his tongue and a serpent in his pocket, he rides in from the south, bringing comfort at first and then death at the end. 2. Anxiety. She wears a dress that leaves nothing to the imagination, for she is afraid of judgment, but passes it over the people as if it were a blessing to them. She is with child for eternity and suffers the pain of childbirth every day without result. She has named him Worry. 3. Obsession. His helm and armor are dark, and if you would search for his eyes, he has none. He is blind to everything around him. He cares not for the weak or for the injured. He speaks rarely, but if he does, his voice carries on until you forget what your own sounds like. 4. Guilt. His presence is commanding, even though he is but a shadow that needs no light to live. Him I fear most, for he carries the broadest of swords and does so with ease, and with it he leads the others into battle. It was clear to me that they would all fall one day, and my will would finally live without fear, and it was with this hope that I held my ground and still battle them to this day. I'll read one more from this book. Yeah, lots of sad stuff in this one. But it was a sad time. I wrote all these poems during 2014, which was the year I tried to get sober by myself before going to an actual professional recovery group. So in that way, I'm very much like my uncles and my grandfather. It's like, we're going to do this on our own. And then one uncle died, and the other two had major heart surgeries, but the two that are still alive are sober today, but that's because they buried their pride and went to treatment. Anyway, this one's called Wine, Worry, War, Part 2. Part 1 is, you don't have to read Part 1 to get Part 2. When I awake, wine, worry, war, sit with leashes in their mouths, waiting for the morning walk. I've barely time to wipe sleep's mischief from my eyes, and already they want my attention. And I give it. I have to. They're always on my mind. I'm enslaved. Certain parts of my mind don't fire the right kind of weapons to fight off their reminders. For example, I could be arranging my life in alphabetical order when war will remind me that it needs to be groomed. Or wine will bark and bark and bark and bark and never stop until I give it what it wants. Worry is different. She follows me around, somewhat like a mangy mutt. Somewhat like that mangy mutt guilt does from time to time. I didn't have any pets until I started to live sober, and I'm hoping one day I can have real dogs. But for now, wine, worry, and war will have to do. So out of that self-published success, and I was selling about a copy a day on Amazon, Macmillan reached out. Macmillan has a couple of different publishing companies. One is St. Martin's Press and the other one's Castle Hill, and they kind of work together, or Castle Point, sorry. And they reached out to me and said, hey, you came highly recommended from one of our other poets. Would you like to do a book deal together? And I said, yeah. It's like my dream. So the dream became reality, and we put out a book called You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering, which is a collection of poems that didn't fit into my first book. So they're all here, and the book is in 4 parts: stillness, dirge, emptiness, and flicker. So we start off with poems that fit into a stillness. Before something bad happens, there's always a quiet, and that's when the overthinking happens. And then a dirge is kind of like, the sad dance you would do when somebody dies. And then there's an emptiness after that person has passed, or that feeling has passed. And then at the end we get a flicker of hope. So I'll read a few pieces from each. They're shorter poems, not as long as in the first book, but I'll read the title piece. You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering. And actually I wanted the title of the book to be something completely different, but the publisher said, no, we like this. And I said, but it's tongue-in-cheek. I said, no, we like it, it's good. And I said, oh, okay, but I was kind of being an idiot when I wrote it. And they said, no, don't worry about that. It's a great title. It's not, okay. Anyway, You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering. I can see it as a lonely world up there. And this is why I am afraid to let go of you. I'm afraid that this free fall will never end. And you should know that this is a suffering in its own right. And on top of that, to be told I must have freedom from you, to let go and be my own person, But when you suffer like I do from a mental distress that seems like a wrinkle in a pair of dress pants that won't iron out, no matter how hot the iron is, then you have no choice but to need some kind of anchor. You see, I need you more than you can understand right now, and that is why I'm afraid you only love me when I'm suffering. Now, this is a poem to my wife, and it started off as a poem to my wife, but it turned out to be a poem to my fans. So I found posting on Instagram to be a great difficulty, because not a lot of people that want to read your stuff get to see it, as some people here who follow me say, like, well, we don't see your stuff, and I'm like, well, you've got to turn on your notifications, or you have to pay Instagram for everybody to see your stuff. But, you know, I found that some people who weren't really my fans would just like stuff when the bad news was happening. So, kind of was an ode to the person who loves bad news, I guess. The next poem is Bandaged. Twisted up in my rain-soaked Sunday best, I picked last night's feast of fractured love for my canines, panting with panic, grasping for some semblance of how to correct this self-vision, this double-minded daring to ask you for yet another do-over. It reeks of last-ditch efforts and broken wings, dressed and bandaged with busted prayers. But now it's all I know, and that's okay for now. So that one was a poem. That one was a poem to my wife. Relapsing is a difficult thing to admit to the person who said, get sober or get out of the house. So before I quit drinking, I was drinking about 2-3 bottles of wine every day, and that's a lot. I work in the insurance industry as my real job, and back then I was working for one of the largest insurance brokers in Western Canada, and there's a lot of schmoozing involved when you become, I guess, here. And so when I was down here, when I got married, I didn't really have to schmooze. But then when I was here, it was expected of me. So in order to get sober, I had to blow up that entire life. Quit my job. It was a really great job. Quit the job, pissed off a lot of people, and worked for someone a lot less busier and less stressful, and rebuilt my life from there. And today I started my own company, so I'm my own boss now.
Good for you.
But I can only have done that if I was sober. Anyway, this one's called Christmas. Something wraps you up like a Christmas present, bought with care, meant to seal the deal. And all you want to do is rip yourself away from it all and run naked through the streets, bare-skinned decorating in the moonlight, wild yet contained to the conditions life has placed on you when you drew your first blood, when you took your first flower, when you gave it all to a fantasy that someone out there would visit and never reveal themselves, and all you got was a sock meant to be worn instead of hung out to dry. This is how it felt when you left. And I'm going to read one small poem here. It's called Cemetery Love. It was one of the first pieces I had actually typed out on my typewriter and put in social media land. It's just a short one here. We jumped 2 stones. It's called Cemetery Love. We jumped 2 stones at night, ran naked through the cemetery, hoping death wouldn't see our souls for what they were, dying to be in love with each other. Alright, I think, how am I doing for time?
You're good.
Yeah, I'm good?
Yeah.
You just keep going and going? Forever, never, Fairy tales. I like that
You
one.
can do a couple more if you want.
Sure.
Yeah.
Madeline, do you have a favorite you want me to read?
All of the things.
Castaway? Oh, which one? The Castle?
Yeah.
Which one is that?
Which one is that? I love it.
You find it? Okay. Isn't that the sign you've made it when you don't know where your own stuff is in your own book? This one's called Fairy Tales. And I wrote this one for my wife. between our second and our third child, we had 2 miscarriages, and unfortunately one happened when we were in Hawaii, which really, as Canadians, it was kind of almost insult to injury when we got the bill at the end of a really terrible situation. So, but everybody was really great. Like, no one was mean. Everyone was very, very kind. It's a really great system you guys have if you can pay for it. But you know, the people were very kind, and it's it made a bad situation, as good as it could be. So we came home from that trip. We tried again. We lost that child, and then so my wife, when we got pregnant with our third, after we had her, and she's 6 now, she slipped into a very different place, and she was diagnosed after many different medications and weird things. She was diagnosed with bipolar 2 as a mood disorder. So now, out of that, she's now in remission for it, but it took a lot of different medications and a lot of work and a lot of exercise and a lot of different things to get her right. So this is a poem that I wrote for her. She never knew why I stayed, despite the eye socket torrents, the false hope and faded starts. I felt that it was never about living life perfectly or about loving someone without fault. It was never about the actual story, the chapters we could write, the gripping prologue, or an epilogue dripping in melancholy, or even about the storybook ending that seemed so inevitable to you. What she failed to see was that, to me, it was all about her flesh on mine, her lips firmly locked in a caress that would set every storybook villain on fire and turn every book to ash. Everything else would fall into place as long as my place was always right beside her, no matter what peril we faced. Okay. So I'm not going down. It's always nice to meet someone from Instagram land here. So we have Colin and Lyndon and Madeline and Tracy. And so Madeline once piped up in one of my live shows and said, "Read Crowns. Read it now."
I love it.
So now I'm here in real life to read it to her. And to you. So this one's Crowns. It's a small piece, but it grabs a lot of people's attention. It represents how I feel about being vulnerable as a writer. You can choose how vulnerable you want to be, and that's why I like writing and being a poet, a songwriter, or whatever it is that I'm writing, because I can choose who I'm going to be. Am I going to be the sad guy? Am I going to be the happy guy? And I had to learn how to be vulnerable. In the early days, when I was writing, I didn't become vulnerable until I decided to let my writing help myself and help other people get sober. And today, even today, 5 years later, I still get daily or weekly, sometimes it's on and off, but every once in a while someone reaches out and says, "I need help, and I don't know how to get sober." And then I can help them, and I know where to send them, right? Anyway, this one's called Crowns. Wear your vulnerability like a crown. Whether it is made of thorns or of wildflowers is up to you. And I think I'll end it there.
Yeah.
Thank you.